rain hit hard that night. Nathan Cole had barely pulled open his front door when he found his new neighbor standing on the porch, soaking wet, her breath unsteady, her eyes carrying something close to desperation. She gripped the strap of her bag and looked him straight in the eye. "I need a husband by Friday." Nathan hadn't exchanged more than 10 words with this woman in the 3 weeks since she'd moved in across the street. He didn't know her last name. He didn't know why she was here. But something in her voice made it impossible to close the door. Nathan Cole had been living in the house on Birchwood Lane for close to 4 years, and in that time, he had become very good at being invisible. He did his work measuring, sanding, refinishing cabinets and floors for clients who found him through word of mouth and came home to a house that was always clean and always quiet. He cooked simple meals, slept without the television on, and kept his porch light off after 9. Most mornings, he was in the garage before 7, and most evenings, he was done before dark. It was a contained life, and he had built it that way deliberately. The divorce had been the beginning of it, though Nathan never thought of it in those terms. He didn't spend much time with the past. What had happened was straightforward enough. 2 people who had convinced themselves they wanted the same life, and eventually, exhaustingly stopped pretending. No dramatic scenes, no accusations loud enough for the neighbors. Just a gradual hollowing out that ended with paperwork, a moving truck he didn't need to rent because she was the one leaving, and the particular silence that follows when a house built for 2 starts holding 1. He had kept the house because she didn't want it. He had kept his tools, his name, and the habit of silence he'd developed somewhere in those last 2 years. Together, when conversation had started to feel like something that cost more than it returned. He told himself he was realistic. The people who described themselves as open to love tended in his observation to be the ones who hadn't yet paid full price for it. He wasn't bitter about this. Bitterness required a level of ongoing engagement with the subject that he'd stopped maintaining. He had simply recalibrated, adjusted his expectations until they matched what he was actually willing to risk, which was not much and hadn't been for a long time. He had noticed Olivia Bennett the day she moved in 3 weeks before the night she appeared at his door. She arrived with a moving truck, a handful of boxes, and the kind of self-sufficiency that people deploy like armor, declining the driver's offer to help carrying her own boxes up the front steps, not asking anyone for directions or assistance. She was sharp-looking without appearing to try. Dark hair, straight posture. The sort of person who gave the impression of having everything organized, even when the boxes stacked around her suggested otherwise. She carried a lamp under one arm and a file box under the other, and didn't look up when Nathan's garage door opened. He watched for about a minute, decided she was not his concern, went back to the cabinet he was refinishing. In the 3 weeks since they had exchanged a combined total of fewer than 10 words, a brief nod across the driveway, once a short wave from opposite sidewalks. That was the full extent of their acquaintance, and Nathan had considered it exactly the right amount. He didn't know her name until she was standing on his porch in the rain telling him she needed a husband by Friday. Olivia Bennett had not planned to end up on a stranger's porch. She had planned in the organized and self-sufficient way she approached most things to find someone to accompany her to her ex-boyfriend's wedding with enough lead time to be relaxed about it. She had a list. She had worked the list. The list had failed her completely. The invitation had arrived the same week she was still unpacking. Ryan and Caroline. The venue, the date, the tasteful font on cream-colored cardstock. She had held it for a long time before setting it face down on the kitchen counter. They had been together for 3 years. He had ended it with the careful calm of a man who had made his decision before he sat down to deliver it, telling her he needed someone who wanted the same future he did. She hadn't argued. She had let him go, because fighting for someone who had already left in his own mind seemed like exactly the kind of thing that confirmed whatever he'd already decided about her. 11 months later, here was the invitation. Apparently, Caroline wanted that same future. Going to the wedding had not been an obvious decision. She had considered ignoring it entirely, sending a polite gift card and a brief note, and never once setting foot near the venue. What changed her mind was harder to articulate. Something in the part of her that had spent the last year quietly, stubbornly rebuilding decided that hiding felt like surrender. Showing up on her own terms with her own life visibly intact felt like something else. She didn't need Ryan to feel anything. She didn't need to win anything back. She just needed to walk into that room and not look like what she was afraid of looking like. The problem was the room would be full of people who had been watching. Former colleagues who had asked careful questions after the breakup. Old friends who had drifted toward one side or the other. People who had watched a 3-year relationship end and had drawn their own conclusions about what that said about her. Walking in alone felt like confirming something. Walking in with someone beside her felt like refusing to. She had spent 3 weeks working the list. One person said he was busy and probably meant it. One agreed and then sent a cancellation text 2 days later with minimal explanation. One offered to come with a half-second hesitation that told her exactly what kind of offer it was, and she said no before he finished the sentence. She crossed name after name until the list was empty, and the wedding was 4 days away. It was a Tuesday night. The rain was coming down hard, and she was standing in her kitchen looking across the street, at the light still on in Nathan Cole's front window. She didn't know much about him. Quiet. Solitary. The kind of man who looked like he had stopped expecting things from people without it becoming a whole personality about it. She had watched him work in his garage a few times from her upstairs window, focused, efficient, no wasted motion. He didn't wave at people unless they waved first. He didn't seem to need anything from the neighborhood. She knocked before she finished deciding. Nathan's first answer was no. He said it plainly, without hostility, the way he said most things. He told her she'd be better served asking someone she actually knew that he was the wrong person for whatever this was. He wasn't trying to be unkind. He simply had no interest in stepping into someone else's complicated emotional situation, and everything about the woman standing on his porch suggested that complicated was the primary feature on offer. Olivia didn't negotiate. She didn't reframe the pitch or try a softer angle. She looked at him and said she had already asked everyone she knew. She listed what she was actually asking for: someone to stand beside her at a reception for a few hours, hold a normal conversation, and not do anything that would need explaining afterward. That was the whole job. She wasn't asking him to pretend to be in love with her. She was asking him not to make things worse. Nathan told her the job wasn't the issue. The issue was the reason behind it. He had no interest in being deployed as a statement at someone else's wedding. That kind of arrangement made everyone involved feel worse than they'd started, and he had enough experience with feeling worse to know it wasn't a direction worth heading. Something shifted in her then. Not dramatically, she didn't break down or raise her voice, but something in the way she was holding herself changed, like she'd stopped maintaining a position she'd been braced in since she crossed the street. She told him she wasn't trying to make Ryan feel anything. She had stopped caring what Ryan felt long before she knocked on this particular door. What she cared about was the 40-something people who would be sitting in that room, who had watched her relationship end and had quietly, without any particular malice, formed their conclusions about what that said about her. She wasn't trying to win anything back. She was trying to walk into a room full of witnesses and not confirm what she already feared they believed. Nathan didn't say anything after that. He stayed in the doorway, and she didn't push. The rain kept going behind her. He was listening to something underneath what she'd said, not the request, not the logistics, but the structure underneath it. The need to perform okay in front of the people who had seen you when you weren't. He recognized that need. He had managed it himself by removing himself from any room where the performance might be required. He had stopped attending things, stopped showing up, stopped giving anyone the opportunity to assess him. Standing there looking at her, he couldn't say with any confidence that his version was the better answer. He stepped back from the doorway and told her to come in out of the rain. They sat at his kitchen table. Her jacket hung over the back of the chair, still damp. He made coffee she barely touched because the situation seemed to call for something to do with his hands. She walked him through the specifics. The wedding was Saturday. The venue was about 40 minutes out. The guest list was mostly people she'd known through Ryan's world. She needed someone who could hold a conversation without making things awkward, who wouldn't say anything that required explaining afterward. Nathan listened without interrupting. When she finished, he told her his condition. Everything between them stayed exactly what it was, a favor between neighbors with a clear start and a clear end. No expectations on either side, no performance beyond what the situation required, and no revisiting any of it after the reception ended. They would go, they would handle it, and then they would go back to being two people who waved at each other occasionally and left it at that. She agreed without any deliberation. No counter, no hesitation, no visible moment of consideration. Nathan noted the speed of it and told himself it was a good sign. It meant she was practical. Practical people were easier to deal with, and practical arrangements were easier to exit cleanly. He did not let himself think too long about what else the speed might mean, because thinking too long about things had a way of changing them, and he had agreed to keep this simple. Simple was the only version of this that made any sense. They had agreed on simple terms, which meant they immediately had to start behaving like people who had agreed on something far more complicated. That problem made itself known within the first day. The wedding guests were not strangers to Olivia. They were former colleagues, old friends, the particular category of people who had been present for the relationship and would now be scrutinizing everything about her appearance at its formal conclusion. She knew how they talked, what they noticed, and exactly how much a recently single woman arriving with an unknown man would need to hold together under the kind of attention that dressed itself up as warmth. A convincing story required more than proximity. It required history, and history required construction. So they spent the evenings before the wedding in preparation dinner at her kitchen table on Wednesday, a walk through the neighborhood Thursday afternoon time, on the couch, going through the facts they'd need to have ready. How they'd met, how long they'd been together, whether he'd been to any of the places that might come up in conversation, the details people asked in the first 5 minutes, and the ones they extracted more carefully over an evening when they were actually trying to figure something out. Olivia had most of it mapped. Nathan had none of it. The problem was that Nathan was built for honesty, not performance. He was honest in the blunt, efficient way of a man who had spent years accountable only to himself, and performing warmth on command was a skill he'd had no occasion to develop. When Olivia suggested he put his hand on her back during a walk just to see how it felt, just so the motion wouldn't look calculated when it counted, he did it the way someone sets down a tool they're not certain they're using, right, careful, functional, and entirely without instinct. She told him it felt like being steadied on a ship. He told her he didn't know how to manufacture something that would have to be actually felt to be done right. She told him that was exactly the problem in one sentence. Thursday evening, they tried dinner at a restaurant near her old office, somewhere a few of her former co-workers went regularly low stakes, just enough of a test to see how they read in the open. She coached him on the walk, over track. The conversation don't fill silences with facts, lean toward her when she's talking. Nathan did his best. The results were uneven. There was a lag to him, a half-beat delay between what was happening in the scene and how his face and body responded, not robotic, but off rhythm, like a man working in a language he'd studied, but didn't dream in. Olivia compensated by talking more, laughing more readily, touching his arm at moments that were fractionally too deliberate. Anyone paying attention would have caught it. She knew that which made her push harder, which made him recalibrate more carefully, which made both of them feel the distance between what they were doing and what it was supposed to look like. By Friday afternoon, they were arguing. It started over a specific detail, the story of how they'd supposedly met, and became something larger before either of them fully tracked the escalation. Olivia told him he wasn't committing to any of it. Nathan told her she was so focused on how she looked to other people that she was making it obvious she hadn't finished grieving the person those other people used to know. It was an accurate thing to say. and accuracy in that direction tends to land harder than anything else. They both went quiet, not because the argument was over, but because what had just been said needed some time to sit with before either of them could say anything useful. They had the pre-wedding gathering to get to that evening. They went. The pre-wedding dinner was held at a restaurant downtown, a private room in the back, 30 or so guests, the kind of gathering designed to feel intimate. But that mostly served as an opportunity for everyone to take stock of where everyone else had landed. Olivia had known she would see Ryan there. She had prepared for it. She hadn't prepared for how little time it would take. Ryan Carter arrived with Caroline on his arm, and the ease of a man who had never once had to talk himself into entering a room. He was well dressed, without overdoing it, and he carried a particular social fluency, the ability to make each person feel briefly centered when he spoke to them that Olivia had once admired and now recognized as something more practiced than it appeared. She watched him move through the room from across it, and what she felt was not what she expected. It wasn't grief, and it wasn't longing. It was something closer to clarity, the specific, mildly deflating experience of seeing something you once found impressive and simply understanding it differently now. He spotted her eventually. She was standing near the far wall with a man none of these people had met, and Ryan had always been quick at registering new information in a room. He came over with Caroline beside him, his expression pleasant and composed, in the way she remembered from the end of their relationship, a particular blend of warmth and distance that cost him nothing and committed him to nothing. He said it was good she came. He said something about all of them being adults. He said he hoped the evening would be enjoyable for everyone. Then his attention moved to Nathan, and something in his expression adjusted a deliberate, calibrated dismissal. He said at a volume 2 nearby guests could hear, without straining, that he hadn't realized Olivia had moved to a new neighborhood. He said it with his smile still in place. He said he supposed things had a way of working out. The implication was clean and precise. Nathan was a convenience. A neighbor pulled in at short notice, transparent to anyone paying even partial attention. Nathan looked at Ryan the way a person looks at something they've already fully accounted for, calm, unhurried, unbothered. Then he told Ryan in a voice that didn't rush that it was good of him to come over and say hello, and that they'd let him get back to his guests. Ryan's smile didn't break, but it stopped traveling. He moved on. Olivia stood very still. She had rehearsed some version of that interaction more times than she would admit, the things she'd say, how she'd carry herself, what she'd make sure not to give away. What she hadn't rehearsed was the thing she was actually experiencing, which had nothing to do with Ryan at all. It was a recognition arriving with the quiet flatness of something that had always been true, but that she hadn't been able to see until now. She had spent the better part of a year organizing her life around the thread of this man's opinion, the apartment she'd chosen, the weeks of anxiety, the list she'd worked to exhaustion, the neighbor she'd knocked on in the rain on a Tuesday night. All of it had been built in some essential way around the question of what Ryan Carter would see when she walked through a door. Standing on the other side of that door now, she couldn't locate why that question had ever seemed worth organizing around. Nathan had not defended her by performing any part of the arrangement they'd agreed to. No scripted warmth, no hand-holding, nothing calculated. He had simply responded to Ryan the way he responded to most things, without urgency, without needing anything returned. It was the least manufactured thing she'd seen in months, and it moved something in her that she wasn't ready to examine directly. The dinner moved on. People ate, conversations crossed the room, and Olivia found she was more present in the evening than she'd anticipated, not performing presence, but actually in it. Nathan was beside her, and he was not warm in any practiced way, but he was solid. When she talked, he listened without the lag that had marked their rehearsals. When she laughed, something in his face shifted without effort. She noticed that and filed it away without labeling it. On the drive home, neither of them said much. The city moved past the windows, and Olivia sat with what the evening had left her and didn't try to sort it too quickly. It wasn't relief. It wasn't victory. It was the specific quiet lightness of setting down something you'd been carrying long enough to forget you were holding it. After the Friday dinner, something between them stopped feeling like an arrangement. They still had the wedding. The following day still had a role to maintain, but the quality of what they were doing had changed. Olivia stopped coaching him. Nathan stopped calculating his responses. What replaced the rehearsal was a rhythm that had nothing to do with convincing anyone of anything. Coffee at her kitchen table Saturday morning, before they got ready conversation that started about logistics and found its way somewhere else. An ease that neither of them had put any effort into building, and that was there anyway. He told her somewhere in that morning about the quiet that had settled into the Birchwood Lane house after the divorce. Not the details of the marriage, he kept those to himself, and she didn't push, but the texture of what came after. How the silence had felt at first like something he'd earned. How gradually, and without any clear moment of transition, it had become simply the condition of his life, rather than something he'd actively chosen. Olivia told him about the year after Ryan left. Not the anger, she'd moved through that already. The more embarrassing part, the months she'd spent reviewing the last stretch of the relationship like footage, looking for the moment she should have caught, the sign she'd missed. Nathan told her in the straightforward way he said most things that there was rarely a single sign. There were usually just two people moving in different directions, and neither naming it out loud until the distance was already a fact. She looked at him after he said that. He looked back. Neither of them said what they were both probably aware of. What was forming between them didn't have a name and didn't need one yet. It had weight, and they both felt it, and neither of them moved to address it. Then Nathan said something that changed the air in the room. He mentioned it the way he mentioned most things about himself, without drama, without any apparent awareness that it landed as significant. He said he had stopped thinking of relationships as something he intended to return to. Not as a wound, not as a declaration, just as a settled fact about where he was delivered, the way someone says they've stopped drinking coffee or moved on from a neighborhood they used to like. A preference that had hardened into something more permanent at some point without a specific moment of decision. Olivia absorbed that and said something non-committal and let the conversation move on. But later, standing at the bathroom mirror, getting ready for the wedding, she stayed there for a long time, because what she had been walking toward carefully over the past several days, not naming it, not touching it, directly had just been given a clear outline. He had decided before she ever knocked on his door. Whatever had been accumulating between them, he had preemptively settled it from his side, and she suspected he didn't fully realize he had done it, which made it harder rather than easier. She was not angry with him. She had no standing to be. She had agreed to his terms quickly and without any negotiation, and she remembered that clearly. But she had started somewhere between the Friday dinner and this particular Saturday morning to feel something real. And feeling something real with no reasonable expectation of it going anywhere was she realized the thing she had been most afraid of all along. Not Ryan. Not the room full of witnesses. This. The wedding was held at a venue about 40 minutes from the city, the kind of place designed to handle events like this efficiently and smoothly, where everything ran on schedule, and the lighting was calculated to make everyone look slightly better than they did in ordinary life. The ceremony ran the right length. The reception that followed was warm in a managed, well-catered way. Olivia had expected the evening to feel like an ordeal, and found instead, walking in beside Nathan, something she hadn't predicted, calm. She moved through the first 2 hours without incident. She smiled in the right places, deflected the careful probes that certain guests couldn't resist phrasing, as warmth accepted the awkward well-wishes from people who didn't quite know how to word them. Ryan was occupied with the business of being a groom. Caroline appeared genuinely kind. Olivia found she had nothing against either of them, which was more than she'd expected, and also, in a quiet way, a relief. Nathan had been beside her for most of the evening, and the difference between this and their rehearsals was stark. There was nothing calculated in how he stood near her. He didn't manage the distance or the angle. He was simply present, and the effect of something that required no maintenance, no upkeep, no calibration was not lost on her. She had stepped toward the far side of the room to get a drink when she heard Ryan's voice, low and carrying from just behind, a temporary partition. He was talking to two men she recognized from his firm. His voice had the relaxed quality of someone who assumed the conversation was private. He was talking about Nathan. He said it with the amusement of someone who had already won and was now enjoying the margins that Nathan looked like a neighbor, that this was exactly what it looked like, that Olivia had found whoever was available when the other options ran out. He said it wasn't sad exactly. It was just very her. She didn't move. The drink she'd been reaching for stayed on the table. Nathan was standing about 10 feet away when she turned. He had heard it, she could tell by the particular stillness that came over him. Not the reactive stillness of someone suppressing a response, but the settled stillness of someone who has arrived at a conclusion. He turned and looked at her, and she looked at him, and what passed between them in that single second was clear enough that neither of them needed to explain it. He picked up his glass and set it down again. He told her quietly that he thought she'd be all right from here. Then he walked toward the exit. Not quickly, not dramatically, just steadily. And she watched him go, and did not move because moving would have required deciding something she wasn't ready to decide. And there were still 40 people in the room who had been watching at some level to see what she would do. She stayed for another 40 minutes. She made the rounds. She said the right things. She left when leaving looked like a choice and not a retreat. The drive home was different from the drive home after the pre-wedding dinner. That night, the silence had held something shared, ground the particular ease of two people who'd been through something together and didn't need to narrate it. This silence had no warmth in it. It was the silence of a space where something had been and was no longer. By the time she pulled into her driveway, she had already understood what she was feeling, and it had nothing to do with Ryan Carter. The wedding had receded almost entirely. The flowers, the room, the faces of people she'd spent weeks building the evening around. All of it was fading at the normal rate of things that turned out not to be the actual point. What hadn't faded was the image of Nathan setting down his glass and the way he'd said she'd be all right, as if all right were the ceiling of what either of them had been working toward. He had believed it, she thought. He had genuinely believed he was doing her a favor, and he wasn't entirely wrong, but he wasn't entirely right either. And the gap between those two things was the part that stayed with her. Across the street, the light in his front window was on. She looked at it for a long moment, then went inside. Nathan had come home to a house that was exactly as he had left it. Everything in its place, nothing out of order. He changed his clothes, made something to eat, and sat at the kitchen table in the same chair he'd sat in for 4 years. The house was exactly right. That was what struck him. For 4 years, the order of this house had been something he maintained deliberately and drew real comfort from. The cleanliness meant control. The quiet meant choice. He had built it as a container for a life that didn't ask difficult things of him, and it had held up exactly as designed. Coming home to it on a Saturday night, he found it held up the same way it always had. Everything functioned correctly, and the house was in a way he was having genuine difficulty accounting for, emptier than he had ever noticed it being. He was not entirely surprised by this. He had known somewhere in the part of him that dealt in honest assessments that spending a week in close proximity to Olivia Bennett was going to cost something on the way out. She was alive in a specific way, present in conversations, quick in her thinking, able to be funny without making a performance of it. And people like that left a particular kind of absence when they stepped out of a room. He had agreed to the arrangement knowing this was a possible outcome and had no one to direct that toward. What he hadn't fully anticipated was how permanent the change felt. The solitude of the last 4 years had always been something he could settle into like a piece of furniture that wasn't comfortable exactly, but that he knew the shape of. What he came home to on Saturday night wasn't that. It was the same chair, same dimensions, but the shape had changed, and it no longer fit the same way. He had walked out of the reception because he'd heard Ryan's voice through the partition, and in the moment removing himself had seemed like the cleanest available move. Staying would have made him something that could be used against her, the neighbor who wouldn't leave the prop, who'd started to think he was a person in the story. He had told himself he was giving her room to stand on her own. He had walked out with the genuine belief that she'd be all right, which was true. And that all right was enough, which was the part he was no longer certain about. He sat at the kitchen table for a long time. He did not for once manage to convince himself that the feeling would settle on its own. 3 days later, on a Tuesday morning, he walked across the street and knocked on her door. Olivia opened the door and looked at him with the expression of someone who had been expecting this and wasn't going to say so first. Nathan told her he owed her a straight conversation. He said he had walked out of the reception because he heard what Ryan said through the partition, and in the moment had decided that the least complicated thing he could do was remove himself, that his presence had become the thing that could be used against her, and he wasn't willing to be that. He said he had told himself it was the right call. He said he had spent 3 days reconsidering. Olivia told him she wasn't angry about the leaving. She had understood the leaving had followed the logic of it, seen the shape of what he was thinking. What she was angry about, if angry was even the right word, was the way he'd said she'd be all right. As if surviving the evening without embarrassment was the full scope of what either of them had been working toward by that point in the week. Nathan said she was right. He said that wasn't all he'd been working toward, and he'd said it anyway because the alternative required saying something he didn't know how to say, and he had defaulted, as he had been defaulting for 4 years, to the version that asked less of him. He told her that he had agreed to help her because he'd thought it was a 4-day transaction with a clean end point. He had been wrong about that. The longer he spent around her, the more he noticed something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not happiness, exactly. Nothing that uncomplicated, but something closer to the sensation of being actually present in his own life, of being a person who was fully in a room rather than someone managing it from a careful distance. He said he had been very good at the distance. He said he was starting to think that wasn't actually something worth being good at. Olivia listened without interrupting. Then she told him that she had knocked on his door 11 days ago, carrying a list of things she was afraid of, and Ryan Carter had been at the top of it, and the wedding had been just below that, and the room full of people who'd been watching had been somewhere in the middle. She said none of those things had made it onto the list she was carrying now. She said the thing she was most afraid of was standing across the kitchen from her at that exact moment, a man who had never once asked her to be anything other than what she was, and who she had no certainty would stay. Nathan told her he couldn't promise to be good at this. He had been away from it long enough that he didn't fully trust his own judgment, and he thought she deserved to know that going in, rather than discovering it later. He wasn't offering her something easy. He was offering her something real, and those two things were not always the same. Olivia said she had already tried easy. Easy was Ryan sitting down with her 3 years into a relationship and explaining in a measured and thoroughly prepared voice what he needed, and then going to find it somewhere else. She said she was considerably less interested in easy than she used to be. They stood in her kitchen for a while after that. Nothing was performed. Nothing was calculated against how it might read to anyone watching. Just two people standing close enough that the question of what came next felt less like a risk than a direction. The following Saturday morning was clear, and still the kind of morning that arrived without making any announcement about itself. Nathan was in the front yard working on the fence along the property line, a section that had been leaning at a slight angle for the better part of a year, the kind of thing he'd noticed and noted and never gotten around to. He had the right tools and no deadline, which was how he preferred to work. He had been at it for about half an hour when he heard Olivia's front door. She crossed the street with 2 mugs of coffee, moving easily the way a person moves when they're not thinking about how they're moving. She handed him one without ceremony and sat down on the front step of his porch. He went back to what he was doing. She didn't comment on the fence. He didn't explain it. They drank their coffee in the kind of quiet that had something in it. Not empty, not managed, just present. There was no version of either of them on that porch performing anything. No story being maintained for the benefit of anyone watching from a window. No calibration against a previous chapter. No ghost of a failed marriage or a wedding they'd attended together, shaping the distance between them. The arrangement had ended. What was left was smaller than what either of them had been trying to construct, before no grand gesture, no moment designed to prove something to anyone, and more durable for exactly that reason. Nathan finished the section he was working on, set down the tool, and picked up his mug. He leaned against the fence and looked at her. She looked back. Neither of them reached for words, because the moment didn't require any, and they had both finally stopped filling silence with things that weren't necessary. This was not the story either of them had set out to tell. Olivia had come to his door with a plan built around an exit, a way to close one chapter in front of the people who'd been watching and come out the other side, looking like she'd made it through. Nathan had agreed to a transaction with a defined perimeter and a clear end date. Both of those things had been true when they started. What neither of them had factored in was the week in between, the failed rehearsals and the honest arguments the Friday dinner, where nothing went according to the script, the drive home, when the silence held something real, the moment in the reception, when he'd responded to Ryan without performing anything at all. The people who leave do not get to determine what comes after. That was the thing Olivia had understood standing alone in that reception room, and the thing Nathan had understood sitting in his quiet house on a Saturday night, watching it be quieter than it had ever been. Their pasts had weight, real weight, the kind that doesn't dissolve, but weight was not the same thing as direction. Two people who had each separately and in different ways decided they were finished with a certain kind of risk, had spent a week in close enough proximity to discover they were wrong about that. It wasn't a conclusion so much as a beginning that had arrived without announcing itself, like that Saturday morning. Like the coffee, like the fence that had been leaning for a year and was finally being put right. Small, practical, and real. That was enough. That was, it turned out, exactly what both of them had needed all along.